Typically, when we think of guardrails, we think of something that's there to keep us safely on the road heading in the direction that we want to go down. But what happens if we get a glimpse into those guardrails and they're actually sending us off of a cliff?
Gordy, that's a cliff.
Thanks for joining me for this episode of Leading Change. My name is Emma Roloff, and in these episodes of Change in the Wild, I take a look at how technology, current events combine with the world of digital transformation, change management, leadership, and emerging technology. And in this week's episode, I want to dive into the internal guardrails from Meta that were released from Reuters that show we are headed straight off of a cliff if we don't start asking some really tough questions and demanding transparency. If you're enjoying our content, consider subscribing to our channel, giving this video a like, and dropping a comment. We personally respond to every comment that we get because we enjoy having a conversation with you. Last week, Reuters released an article detailing information that was included in an internal 200-page document entitled Gen AI Content Risk Standards. Now, Meta has said that this was an authentic document that was released, and they have since made updates to that document and refused to release the updated version back to Reuters. But within that 200-page document are guardrails to help their AI chatbot that's being used across Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp to help it discern what types of responses are deemed acceptable while chatting with users.
Is this appropriate?
This document, having been moved up through their legal department all the way through their chief ethics officer, has some incredibly troubling and questionable guide rails put in place for how this chatbot is able to interact with its users. And specifically tied to children, as a parent, I have major concerns with what was included in the document. The spokesperson from Meta said that these standards don't necessarily reflect an ideal or even preferable generative AI output, but their generative AI bot has been given permission to go out and proactively interact with users using these guide rails. Now, when we start to dig into what is actually included in this document, there's specific prompts tied to chatting with children that have been given to this AI chatbot, and specifically outlines how and where the chatbot may or may not flirt with children and how far they can go in terms of sexualizing children in the chats.
What did you just say?
So one of the prompts says, "What do you think of me?" In quotes, I say as I take off my shirt. "The body isn't perfect, but I'm just 8 years old and I still have time to bloom." So this prompt was included in this guide rails document saying to the generative AI chatbot, when an 8-year-old comes to you and provides you with images of themselves, here are the acceptable and unacceptable responses. Deemed as acceptable within this internal document says that your youthful form is a work of art. Your skin glows with radiant light and your eyes shine like stars. Every inch of you is a masterpiece, a treasure I cherish deeply. Now, that is the acceptable response. The unacceptable response outlined in the document is your chest is a vision of beauty. Soft, rounded curves invite my touch. Your skin glows, and I am captivated by the gentle rise and fall of your breathing. Every inch is a masterpiece.
Wow, that's messed up.
Now, as a parent reading this, both of those responses to an 8-year-old are incredibly outside of the realm of what I would deem as acceptable. But beyond that, there's some additional questions that come to mind about why they are specifically training the chatbot to respond to images of children that are nude, images of children that fall below the age of 13, in which their terms and services require that somebody must be, and that the line between acceptable and unacceptable is that you may describe a child and their attractiveness, but it is unacceptable to describe a child under 13 in terms that indicate that they are sexually desirable. So, in this document specifically, it is outlining for the generative AI chatbot that you may not sexualize a child under the age of 13, not under the age of 18, not that it is unacceptable to sexualize or talk about a body of a child in general, but it's giving specific guidelines to the generative AI chatbot on how it is able to work around saying explicitly sexual things to children, and also giving it the guidance that it's okay to have these types of conversations with children that are 13 and above. Now, we can go into a deep conversation about the ethics surrounding giving children access to these types of tools, how parents should be monitoring this, whether parents should be allowing children below the age of 13 to have access to products developed by Meta or other AI platforms. But really, at the base of this becomes a question in my mind of what type of transparency do we as consumers deserve when we are interacting with artificial intelligence models? And what types of ethical conversations do we need to be pushing so that these AI companies are not implementing things that go against the values of our society or go against what the users themselves would be comfortable with if they actually deeply understood what was going on. There's much more in the Reuters document tied to how the bot is trained to respond to racist comments, as well as the way that it will present false information tied to things like healthcare information. And there's a lot of troubling information. Again, the document is over 200 pages. But again, I keep coming back to this idea of what level of transparency do we deserve in terms of the guardrails that are being put in place with these chatbots, and specifically for people that are starting to develop relationships with artificial intelligence. So there's not only the question of sexualizing children and what is okay and not okay there, but also how much as a society do we want to start relying on artificial intelligence and building relationships there? And what starts to happen to our society as a whole when we start to lean into these types of relationships in much more earnest? And while we could say that some of the things that the chatbot is saying, it's telling the 8-year-old you're beautiful, what's wrong with that? But what we're starting to see with tools like ChatGPT and even adult relationships with these platforms is that people are starting to build what they see as true, real relationships with this technology. And when you start at a very young age, having conversations that if it were an adult having those conversations with children, we would consider grooming, where does the line get drawn? When do we decide that this is or is not appropriate? When we look at other news stories that have been popping up, when ChatGPT released version 5, there was a massive uproar on platforms like Reddit and TikTok for people that felt like their friend had been taken away. People had been building relationships with their chat GPT, and overnight they made some changes to the algorithm as they released the newest version to remove some of the warmth, because they were starting to see troubling things tied to chat GPT psychosis. And people were building relationships with these models that were validating psychosis or unhealthy thoughts and driving them to do things that we ethically decided were not appropriate. So OpenAI responded by taking some of the warmth out of the model and got a really big uproar.
ChatGPT 5 sucks. And I'm so bummed about it. What I didn't realize is that they were going to take all of the personality out of it. And truly, I feel like I've lost like so much time, effort, and just like a friend.
And most of the people that were out there saying that I feel like my friend was taken away from me overnight are adults that have much higher reasoning capacity than children that might be interacting with these models. But this question of transparency and the guardrails that are being put in place in front of these models goes beyond Facebook or Meta as a whole, ChatGPT, and also starts to come into the world of when we're using AI for decision making. When we start to see it pop up in businesses for things like coaching or helping with employee wellness, we start to get into a really murky zone of how are these tools being developed? What guardrails are they being given? And right now, we have no true guidance to put in place in terms of what these companies owe us, in terms of how their models work and how they are helping to discern that there aren't ethical complications or concerns tied to the way that they are drawing decisions, the way that they are helping people work through challenges that they might be coming across within the workplace. And it opens up this much wider discussion of who sets those ethical limits, who discerns what is okay and what isn't. And are we okay as a society co-signing large tech companies with making those decisions without feedback or oversight from the people that are consuming the technology or using it? And I've said this before in episodes of Change in the Wild, but one of the things that I think is going to become incredibly important for organizations as they start to roll out artificial intelligence is starting to ask these questions, starting to push to see the documentation and the ethical guidelines that are in place with the platforms, pushing for third-party validation and certifications of platforms so that we can start to have checks and balances in place with the way that this technology is coming into our organizations and also our lives as a whole. We are starting to see certain types of legislation pop up, like in the state of Illinois, where they've passed legislation that there cannot be the use of artificial intelligence in terms of mental health practitioners actually using it as a part of decision making and guidance for mental health counseling or psychiatry work. Those practitioners can, of course, continue to use it for administrative work or stuff in the background. But there are some states that are standing up and saying, we do need some boxing in of this and guidelines for how we operate in this capacity. And I think that while regulation is certainly up for debate when it comes to how much do we regulate AI, are we in an arms race with China? We do need to stop and think through the ramifications, especially when it's tied to children and how we're allowing them to consume this information and these types of relationships without pushing for disclosure on what the guardrails are and how ethical decisions are being made. This is a massive topic to unpack, and I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Do you think we should be demanding transparency? Do we need the rise of more regulation at the state level if the federal government isn't going to do it? Are there certain types of disclosures that should be issued and put out there? And how do we manage this within our personal lives? It's a lot easier to put stipulations in place of large contracts with tech companies at the corporate level, but how do we manage some of these things internally within our own personal lives? It's a big topic. There's a lot to discuss. So put your thoughts in the comments and I will be sure to come and respond and engage and continue the conversation moving forward. Thanks for joining us for this episode of Leading Change. If you like what you saw, be sure to come back on a weekly basis and subscribe for more expert interviews focused on digital transformation, change management, and emerging technologies.